from St. Louis Public Radio. This is St. Louis on the Air.
The reformists would go on to say, but ideally it should be, reform, rehabilitation, amends making, that sort of thing. We call it the Missouri Department of Corrections, right? We don't call it the Missouri Department of Punishment. Yeah. The way he talked about cases, what did kind of have this, what you might call old school Law and Order sort of tone.
I'm Jeremy Goodwin. The lingering influence of a prosecutor who was really good at sending people to death row. Bob McCulloch stood out among prosecutors nationally for his success getting the death penalty for defendants he prosecuted. He's been out of office since 2019, but 3 of the 23 people he sent to death row are scheduled for execution in coming months. Ryan Krull has a deep dive into Bob McCulloch's legacy, published this week in the Riverfront Times. It's part of a series that explores the death penalty in St. Louis County called Shadow of Death. That series is sponsored by the River City Journalism Fund. Ryan Krull, welcome to the program.
Hey, thanks for having me, Jeremy. Appreciate being here.
We're glad to have you. So the first thing is, why is Bob McCulloch someone for us to be looking at and talking about and thinking about in 2022?
Yeah, that's such a good question. You mentioned the Ferguson Uprising in your intro there. He really came, I think, on a lot of people's radar in 2014 whenever he presented evidence to the grand jury who chose not to indict Darren Wilson, the man who killed Michael Brown. At the time, people protesting in the streets, other folks, many of them viewed McCulloch as a bit of a villain. Sort of on the other side of the coin, he really became this sort of hero to like the Blue Lives Matter movement, you might say, which was sort of nascent at the time. But however, 4 years later, this issue of how his office handled the death penalty, I think, has really become more and more salient because these death penalty cases take so long to work their way through the system, even after the jury, sentences an individual to death. That's kind of his most salient legacy at the moment right now, because as you said, there's 3 individuals right now on death row, put there by McCulloch's office, who are set to be executed. I think it's in the next 3 or 4 months. Then there's another 3 individuals whose execution dates are going to be sometime after that. If I have my numbers correct, right now there's 18 people on Missouri death row, and 6 of those folks came from St. Louis County. So
18 from the state of Missouri
in total. I hope that number is correct, but I know that you could say that St. Louis County is very well represented, perhaps overrepresented, some people would say, on Missouri death row.
How does McCulloch's record compare with his peers nationally?
Yeah, so there's a professor who looked into this from North Carolina, and to sort of, perhaps at the risk of oversimplifying it just a little bit, he was on the sort of extreme edges of what would be considered normal, I guess, where he was a high user of the death penalty. I think Professor Baumgartner referred to him as a very, very high user. So I don't know, we could kind of look at statistics and standard deviation. He wouldn't be way, way outside the norm, but he would be definitely on that high use end of things. Okay. He's not in there's sometimes on the internet or wherever you see these top 10 lists of prosecutors in terms of using the death penalty. He's usually not on those, but probably if that list went to 20 or something like that, he might. Okay. His office would be.
And you spoke with him recently?
Yeah, we chatted a few weeks ago. As far as I know, he keeps a pretty low media profile.
Yeah.
So I don't know that he'd spoken to a reporter in some time. And I was very grateful for the time. He seemed to talk as long as I wanted to. We talked for several hours.
What did you learn from that conversation?
Well, I learned that he, many things. One, he is, very adamant. No, I don't have any regrets about the way I handled any cases. His office certainly handled a lot of cases over 28 years as a prosecuting attorney's office, responsible for an area as big as St. Louis County. They're going to just have a high volume of cases. And the other thing I was impressed by was he had a pretty terrific recall of specific cases, even ones, certainly ones where he was the lead prosecutor, but others where he had just sort of, one of the people in his office had handled the case. He knew his facts really, really well, things that I had sort of, read up on in preparation of the interview, and he didn't know I was necessarily going to bring up. He knew exactly what I was talking about and was always able to kind of talk about them in some depth in a kind of impromptu way. So that struck me. Yeah.
Did you find at times that maybe what he said was revealing in a way he didn't intend?
Well, I think, so he was first elected in 1990. So he had that job for 28 years. And, he's I guess a product of his time. I did sense that the way he talked about cases, what did kind of have this, what you might call old school Law and Order sort of tone. And I guess the one thing I guess is important to keep in mind is that was sort of his ID, or I'm sorry, his identity or his brand, if you will. He was this Law and Order individual. And, electorally, politically, that served him really well. He was elected in 90, reelected 6 times, wide margin, never much competition to speak of. But then all of a sudden, this asset that I think had really benefited him, this kind of Law and Order identity, after Michael Brown, that was just not what people wanted in a prosecutor anymore. And then Wesley Bell beat him pretty handily in 2018 by about a 13-point margin. Yeah,
and you mentioned old school Law and Order. Some of his remarks, supporters might call it no nonsense or simply tough on crime. But a reporter asked him, this details in your story, you weren't the reporter, but a reporter asked him what convicted serial killer Kelvin Malone's motive might have been, and he said he was mean.
Yeah.
Does that indicate to you a sophisticated grasp of the sources of crime?
So I think that McCulloch, that's such a good question. I would say that quote and sometimes the sort of brevity with which he talked publicly about cases, particularly before 2014, perhaps wouldn't indicate that. But I think if you sat him down, and I know for a fact because he and I did talk about the Kelvin Malone case pretty significantly, he would be able to tell you, you might disagree with the choice here, the choice of seeking the death penalty, but he would be able to give you a very in-depth explanation of the aggravators in that case that led to his office seeking the death penalty. Mm-hmm. Again, you might disagree with him, but he would be able to give you a more full-throated or more complete explanation. Now, again, you might say, well, from a PR standpoint, maybe those sort of remarks can be interpreted as curt or callous. Mm-hmm. It might not sort of do him any favors, especially in our sort of current climate. But that's kind of the way he talked to the media a lot. And there's other sort of examples of folks who his office prosecuted were sentenced to death, and then after they were put to death, a reporter would ask him about it, and he would be a little bit he would be very brief in his remarks. It was just his style.
Yeah. Well, another quote from him in the story is, the primary purpose of the criminal justice system is punishment. And you mentioned that's one rare point of agreement between him and some of his critics. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so that's sort of one of those things, where I guess sort of akin to like when someone like Donald Trump and Noam Chomsky kind of are on the same page, maybe, but for totally different reasons and with sort of totally different judgments being made that lead to the same conclusion. So McCulloch said to me, this is one of the things I actually was pretty surprised to hear him say. He said, that the primary purpose of the criminal justice system is punishment. And I think there's a lot of sort of activists who would agree that yes, that as it is structured now, that is the sort of primary purpose of the justice system. Is to punish individuals. I think the sort of activists or the reformists would go on to say, but ideally it should be reform, rehabilitation, amends making, that sort of thing. I mean, and we call it the Missouri Department of Corrections, right? We don't call it the Missouri Department of Punishment. Yeah.
Does Bob McCulloch, does the arc of his career say anything to us about the justice system in this region and possibly inequities in that system?
Yeah, that is a really good question. So I think the best way to sort of speak to that would be to point out that in 2018, the election that he lost, that his defeat was really 4 years in the making. There was a lot of folks in 2014 not happy with the way he handled the Darren Wilson non-indictment, and they sort of said to themselves, okay, we have to figure out how to get this guy out of office. And it turned out whenever these activists would go campaign against McCulloch, or sort of set the seeds for a campaign against McCulloch, they found that there's a lot of folks, they would go knock on doors, and individuals would say, first of all, they would express surprise that McCulloch was even in an elected position. They thought that because he had been prosecutor for so long, that it was something that he didn't have to get reelected to every 4 years. And the other thing they would say was, oh, wow, McCulloch, that guy, he locked up my dad, he locked up my son, he locked up my brother, he locked me up. So they discovered there was this sort of untapped, I guess, animosity against McCulloch that hadn't really...
After 28 years.
After 28 years, yeah, exactly. That existed. It was sort of in the DNA of the electorate, I guess you would say, but it hadn't really resulted in folks showing up to the polls to vote against him. Again, because a lot of these folks weren't even aware they could vote against the prosecutor was an elected position. So I think once these political activists were able to sort of put two and two together, hey, there's this constituency of people who will eagerly go to the polls to vote against this guy. They just kind of need to have that on their radar. I think once that happened, I think his fate was probably sealed.
Having sat down with the man and looking so closely at the history, has your understanding of Bob McCulloch and his career as a prosecutor changed?
Yeah, I didn't have I didn't have too many preconceived notions going in. I guess one thing that I did sort of reflect on is I do, you wonder these kind of counterfactuals, if maybe he had, read the room, so to speak, or read the sort of tide that started changing after 2014. Very late in the election campaign in 2018, he did start sort of presenting himself with a little bit of kind of a softened edge, where he did talk about these diversion courts that he'd set up, leniency to folks who have drug or mental health issues. But I think it was too little, too late. So I guess on some level it's understandable. You're in that job for almost 30 years. Perhaps you take it for granted a little bit that you're just going to get reelected. He didn't show up to a lot of debates. I don't think he took Bell very seriously, again, until it was probably too late to sort of change course. Yeah. So there is maybe just some wisdom in that story.
Well, the Riverfront Times' Ryan Krull, his article, former St. Louis County Prosecutor Bob McCulloch Has No Regrets, is in this week's Riverfront Times and on our website at stlpr.org. It's a story commissioned by the River City Journalism Fund. Ryan, thanks so much for being here. Yeah, and hey, I really appreciate it. And you mentioned the River City Journalism Fund. Just for folks who are interested in learning more about that, check out rcjf.org. It's a great new initiative. Appreciate you having me. You bet. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio.
Today's episode was produced by Alex Hoyer and Elaine Cha, her first one.
Audio engineering and podcast design by Aaron Dorr. Our production intern is Avery Rogers. Our executive producer is Alex Hoyer.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
Our podcast proudly supports St. Louis artists by using music from Life Creative Group.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations, and leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thank you.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to conservation and careful management of the state's forests to make them more resilient and better habitats for wildlife. Choosewood.com.